The gavel didn't just end a marriage, it silenced a truth that had been buried for 10 years. When Alice stepped out of the heavy oak doors of the Manhattan Supreme Court, she was entirely alone. No lawyer, no family, no assets. She had just lost everything to the man who swore to protect her. Inside, he was popping champagne. Outside, the silence on the courthouse steps was deafening, but as she took her third step toward the street, a single notification pinged on a reporter's phone. Then another. Then 100. In seconds, the silence shattered. The cameras didn't just turn toward her, they rushed her. But they weren't asking about her defeat. They were asking about the body found in the trunk of a car, registered to the man who had just won. The sound of the gavel hitting the mahogany block was sharper than a gunshot. It echoed through the high-ceilinged chamber of courtroom 302, a finality that seemed to suck the air right out of the room. Order. Judge Harrison said, his voice devoid of sympathy. He adjusted his glasses, peering down at the trembling woman in the defendant's chair. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented regarding financial mismanagement and emotional instability, I am granting full custody of the minors Leo and Sophie Thorne to the plaintiff, Mr. Julian Thorne. Furthermore, regarding the division of assets, the prenuptial agreement stands valid. Ms. Vance is to vacate the Greenwich property within 24 hours. This court is adjourned. Alice Vance didn't scream. She didn't cry. She sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles had turned a ghostly white. It felt like the floor had opened up beneath her, swallowing her whole. Across the aisle, Julian Thorne, the CEO of Thorne Dynamics, and arguably one of the most powerful men in New York's tech sector, stood up. He smoothed the lapels of his $10,000 charcoal Brioni suit. He didn't even look at Alice. He turned to his lawyer, a shark of a man named Marcus Sterling, and shook his hand firmly. "Excellent work, Marcus," Julian said, his voice loud enough for Alice to hear. "Clean, precise." "Just doing my job, Mr. Thorne," Marcus replied, smirking as he packed his briefcase. Alice felt a hand on her shoulder. It was her court-appointed attorney, a weary woman named Sarah Jenkins, who had been outmatched from day one. Sarah had tried, but fighting Julian Thorne with a public defender's budget was like trying to stop a tsunami with a paper umbrella. "Alice," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with pity. "I'm so sorry. We can try to appeal, but with the evidence they fabricated regarding your mental health, it's going to be an uphill battle." Alice slowly turned her head. Her eyes, usually a vibrant green, looked dull and hollow. "He bought the psychiatrist, Sarah. You know he did. I never missed a therapy session. I never hurt my children. I know," Sarah said, lowering her eyes. "But we couldn't prove it. Julian covers his tracks too well." Alice stood up, her legs feeling like jelly. She looked across the room one last time. Julian was laughing now, sharing a joke with a blonde woman who had been sitting in the gallery, Isabella Cruz, his executive assistant, and the woman currently living in the house Alice had designed for her children. Isabella caught Alice's eye and offered a tiny, cruel wave. The bailiff moved toward them. "Ma'am, we need to clear the courtroom." Alice nodded numbly. She picked up her battered leather purse, the only designer item she had left after Julian had frozen her accounts 6 months ago. She walked toward the center aisle. As she passed Julian, he finally acknowledged her. He stepped into her path, blocking her exit. He smelled of expensive cologne and arrogance. He leaned in close, his voice, a low, dangerous whisper that only she could hear. "I told you, Alice," Julian hissed, a cold smile playing on his lips. "No one leaves, Julian Thorne. You walk away when I say you walk away, and when you do, you walk away with nothing." Alice looked up at him. For the first time in months, a spark of something other than fear ignited in her chest. It was small, barely a flicker, but it was there. "You took my children, Julian," she said, her voice shaking but audible. "You took my home. You took my reputation. And I'll take your freedom next if you ever try to speak to the press again." He threatened, smoothly pulling back as if he had just offered her a polite goodbye. "Enjoy the subway ride, darling." He brushed past her, Isabella clinging to his arm, his legal team flanking him like a phalanx of soldiers. They exited through the judge's private chambers, a privilege bought and paid for, avoiding the media circus waiting out front. Alice was left standing alone in the empty courtroom. The bailiff jingled his keys impatiently. "Mum, I'm going," Alice whispered. She turned and walked toward the heavy double doors at the back of the room. She pushed them open. The hallway was long marble and cold. Her heels clicked rhythmically, a lonely sound in the vast corridor of justice. She checked her phone. No messages, no friends asking how it went. Most had abandoned her when the smear campaign started, when Julian's PR team leaked stories about her substance abuse and erratic behavior. She was truly completely alone. She reached the revolving doors leading to the main steps of the courthouse. She could see the blur of the city outside the grey sky, the drizzle of rain. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. She knew the press was there. They were waiting for Julian, but they would settle for the disgraced ex-wife. She tightened her grip on her purse. "Just keep walking," she told herself. "Don't look at the cameras. Don't answer questions. Just get to the subway." She pushed the glass door and stepped out into the biting November air. The moment Alice stepped onto the wide stone landing of the Supreme Court, the atmosphere felt wrong. Usually, high-profile divorce cases attracted a specific kind of chaos. Paparazzi, shouting names, flashes popping like strobe lights, reporters thrusting microphones over barricades. Alice braced herself for the impact, lowering her head to shield her face with her hair. But the shouting didn't come. Instead, there was a strange, vibrating murmur. There were at least 50 members of the press gathered at the bottom of the stairs. Vans from CNN, Fox News, and local affiliates lined the street. But the reporters weren't looking at the doors. They weren't looking at Alice. They were all looking at their phones. Alice paused at the top of the stairs, confused. The wind whipped her coat around her legs. Had Julian already left? Had he distracted them? She took a tentative step down. Click-clack. At the sound of her heel hitting the stone, a photographer from the New York Post, a man named Gregory, who had written vicious articles about her for weeks, looked up. His face wasn't sneering today. It was pale. His mouth hung slightly open. He nudged the cameraman next to him. "Hey, look!" The cameraman looked up. Then a reporter from Channel 4. Then another. One by one, the heads snapped up from the glowing screens. The murmur died out, instantly replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. 50 pairs of eyes locked onto Alice Vance. She froze on the third step. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Why were they looking at her like that? It wasn't the usual predatory gaze of the paparazzi. It was something else. It looked like shock, fear even. "Miss Vance." The voice came from the front row. It was a young reporter from a digital news outlet, a girl named Sarah with bright red glasses. Her hand holding a microphone was trembling. Alice took a breath. I have no comment. Please just let me pass." She tried to descend the stairs quickly, keeping her eyes on the pavement, hoping to slip through the side. "Miss Vance, or—" The shout came from the back, loud and urgent. "Miss Vance, did you know—" Alice stopped. She turned slightly. "Know what—" "The report." Gregory from the post yelled, stepping over the barricade. He didn't rush her aggressively. He moved with a strange, frantic energy. He held up his phone, the screen displaying a breaking news banner in bold red. The DOJ just released the unsealed indictments 2 minutes ago. Alice frowned. Indictments I don't understand. My trial is over. I lost. Not for you, Gregory said, his voice rising in excitement. For him? Suddenly the dam broke. The silence shattered into a roar of chaos. But the questions were different now. They weren't asking, why did you lose custody? Or, are you really an alcoholic? Ms. Vance, is it true you were the whistleblower? Alice, did you know about the server farms in Ukraine? Ms. Vance police are raiding Thorn Dynamics right now. Can you comment on the money laundering charges? Alice stood there, the wind buffeting her face, completely bewildered. What? She whispered. What are you talking about? A large black SUV screeched to a halt at the curb, cutting off a news van. The doors flew open. 4 men in dark suits with earpieces jumped out. They weren't private security. They wore navy blue windbreakers with yellow lettering on the back. FBI. The crowd gasped and parted. The lead agent, a tall man with graying hair and a stern face, marched up the stairs toward Alice. He moved with purpose, ignoring the flashing cameras that were now going berserk. Alice backed up, terrified. I didn't do anything, she cried out, her back hitting the railing. I just left court. I didn't do anything. The agent stopped 2 steps below her. He looked at her, his expression softening just a fraction. He pulled a badge from his pocket. Mrs. Vance, he said, his voice cutting through the noise of the press. I'm Special Agent Miller, Financial Crimes Division. You're not under arrest. Then what is this? Alice stammered, gesturing to the frenzy around them. Agent Miller looked past her toward the courthouse doors she had just exited. We need you to come with us for your protection, ma'am. Protection from who? From your ex-husband, Miller said grimly. We just executed a warrant on Julian Thorne's private residence and his headquarters. We found the files, Mrs. Vance, the ones he thought he destroyed, the ones proving he's been laundering cartel money for 5 years. Alice's world tilted. Cartel. But that's not all. Miller continued, stepping closer as the reporters screamed for sound bites. 10 minutes ago, a witness came forward. A private contractor named David Halloway. He claims he was hired by Mr. Thorne to rig the gas line in your parents' house 3 years ago. Alice felt the blood drain from her face. Her knees gave out. She grabbed the cold railing to keep from collapsing. Her parents hadn't died in an accidental leak. It was murder. Oh my God, she whispered, her hand covering her mouth. We have an arrest warrant for Julian Thorne, Agent Miller said, turning to face the courthouse doors. And according to our intel, he's still inside the building. As if on cue, the heavy doors behind Alice burst open. But it wasn't Julian strutting out in triumph this time. Julian Thorne stumbled out his tie, crooked his face, a mask of pure panic. He was shouting into his cell phone. Get the jet ready. Now I don't care about flight paths, just... He stopped dead when he saw the sea of cameras. Then he saw the FBI agents. And then he saw Alice. She was standing on the steps, wind-blown and broken, yet somehow she was the only thing standing between him and the wall of federal agents. The silence returned instantaneous and heavy. The 2 former lovers locked eyes. 10 minutes ago he was a king, and she was a peasant. Now the chessboard had been flipped so violently the pieces were still falling. Julian dropped his phone. It clattered down the stone steps, landing at Alice's feet. Alice! Julian choked out his voice, trembling. He took a step toward her, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of pleading. Alice, baby. Tell them. Tell them it's a misunderstanding. You know me. You know I wouldn't. Alice looked at the man who had taken her children, the man who had likely killed her parents, the man who had just smirked as he left her destitute. She looked at Agent Miller. Then she looked back at Julian. She straightened her spine. She wiped a single tear from her cheek. I don't know this man, Alice said clearly, her voice picked up by every microphone in the vicinity. Agent Miller nodded to his team. Take him. The back of the FBI SUV smelled of stale coffee and sanitizer. The windows were heavily tinted, turning the frenzied mid-afternoon Manhattan streets into a blur of muted grey. Alice sat in the middle row, her hands trembling so violently she had to clasp them between her knees to stop them. Agent Miller sat in the front passenger seat, twisting around to face her. The partition was open. We're taking you to the Federal Building on 26 Federal Plaza. Miller said, his tone professional, but not unkind. Technically, you are a person of interest, Mrs. Vance. But based on the intel Holloway gave us, we're operating under the assumption that you are a victim. A victim, Alice repeated the word, tasting like ash in her mouth. He took my children, Agent Miller. He stood in that courtroom not 20 minutes ago and took my children. Where are they? Miller hesitated. That hesitation sent a spike of ice straight into Alice's heart. Where are Leo and Sophie? She demanded, her voice rising. We have agents en route to the Greenwich house, Miller said quickly. And the school. We have a containment team securing all of Julian's known assets. We'll have them safe within the hour. Alice slumped back against the seat. The image of Julian's face on the courthouse steps, that sheer, unadulterated panic kept flashing in her mind. Julian Thorne never panicked. He was a machine, a man who calculated probabilities like others breathed air. If he was scared, the situation was catastrophic. You said, murder, Alice whispered. My parents. The gas leak. Miller sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. 3 years ago, your father Thomas Vance was threatening to audit the books of a charity foundation called Vance Thorne Hope. It was the non-profit Julian set up in your name, remember? Of course, Alice said. It builds libraries in developing countries. I managed the PR for it. It didn't build libraries, Alice, Miller said softly. It built server farms for the Volkov Syndicate. It was a laundering wash. Your father found the discrepancies. He called Julian on a Friday. The gas leak happened on Sunday. Alice squeezed her eyes shut. A sob caught in her throat, jagged and painful. She remembered that Sunday, Julian holding her while she screamed at the funeral. The way he had handled the insurance, the police report, the tragic accident narrative. He had comforted her with the same hands that signed the order to kill her parents. I slept next to a monster, she thought. For 10 years. The SUV slowed as they approached the underground garage of the Federal Building. The concrete walls closed in around them. Why now? Alice asked, opening her eyes. Why did this all break today? The timing. It's impossible. Miller turned back as the car stopped. Because of the custody hearing, Alice. What raw? Julian got greedy, Miller explained as he opened his door. He didn't just want the kids because he loves them. The trust fund set up for Leo and Sophie are the final holding tanks for the laundered assets. As long as they were minors and he had full custody, he had full signatory power. If you had won even partial custody today, you would have gained access to those accounts. He couldn't risk you seeing the balances. He had to destroy you completely to keep control of the money. Alice felt sick, physically sick. He hadn't fought for his children. He had fought for his wallet. They ushered her into an elevator, then down a long corridor to a conference room, not an interrogation cell, thankfully. It had a window overlooking the Brooklyn Bridge. "Sit tight," Miller said. "I need to check on the extraction team." He left the room. Alice stood by the window, watching the tiny cars moving on the bridge below. She felt entirely dissociated, as if she were watching a movie about someone else's life. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The door opened, but it wasn't Miller. It was a woman in a sharp navy suit, holding a tablet. She looked frazzled. "Mrs. Vance, I'm Assistant U.S. Attorney Kate Ross. We have a problem." Alice spun around. "My children." "We secured the Greenwich house," Ross said, her voice tight. "Isabella Cruz was there. She was arrested on sight. But the children weren't there." "The school," Alice gasped, moving toward the door. "They're at St. Jude's." "We checked St. Jude's," Ross said, blocking her path gently. "Julian pulled them out of class at 10:00 a.m., 2 hours before the verdict." Alice's knees buckled. Ross caught her by the elbow and guided her into a chair. "He knew," Alice whispered. "He knew there was a chance he might get caught. He took them as leverage." "We don't know that for sure," Ross said, though her eyes betrayed her doubt. "We have an APB out on the nanny, a woman named Magda." "Magda would never hurt them," Alice said, grasping at straws. "She loves them." "Magda has a brother in federal prison for racketeering," Ross stated flatly. "Julian paid his legal fees. She's loyal to him, Mrs. Vance." The door opened again. Miller stormed in, looking furious. He threw a file onto the table. "He's not talking," Miller growled. "We have Julian in box 1. He's lawyered up. Marcus Sterling is in there screaming about illegal search and seizure. Julian is sitting there with a smug look on his face, refusing to give up the location of the kids unless he gets a deal." "What kind of deal?" Ross asked. "Immunity," Miller spat. "Full immunity. He gives us the syndicate, he walks free, and he returns the children." "No," Alice said. The word came out low, vibrating with a rage she didn't know she possessed. She stood up. "No immunity. He killed my parents. He ruined my life. He is not walking away." "Alice, he has your children," Miller said gently. "If he arranged for them to be moved out of the country, we might never find them." "He won't move them yet," Alice said, her mind racing connecting dots she hadn't seen before. "He needs them close. He needs their biometrics." Miller and Ross exchanged a confused look. "Biometrics?" "The safety deposit boxes in Zurich." Alice said the memory surfacing from years ago. He bragged about it once when he was drunk. He said the ultimate failsafe wasn't a password. It was a retinal scan, but not his. The kids, Miller realized. He used their biometric data as the key. "He can't leave the country without them," Alice said firmly. "And he can't access the money without them. He's stuck. He's bluffing." "He might be bluffing," Miller said. "But we can't take that risk. We have 48 hours before the syndicate realizes Julian is burned and they start cleaning house. If they find the kids before we do." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. "Let me talk to him," Alice said. "Absolutely not," Ross said immediately. "It's too dangerous. He's manipulative. He thinks I'm weak," Alice cut in. "He thinks I'm the broken alcoholic housewife he painted in that courtroom. He thinks he won. That gives me the advantage." She looked at Miller, her green eyes hard as diamonds. "Put a wire on me. Let me go into that room. I know which buttons to push. I know what he's afraid of." Miller looked at Ross. Ross bit her lip, then nodded slowly. "You have 10 minutes," Miller said. "If he touches you, we storm in." The observation room was dark, lit only by the monitors showing the feed from the interrogation room next door. Alice stood behind the one-way glass watching Julian. He looked different without his suit jacket. He was in his white dress shirt, top button undone, sleeves rolled up. He wasn't handcuffed, a courtesy for white-collar criminals that made Alice's blood boil. He was leaning back in his chair, sipping a glass of water, looking bored. Marcus Sterling, his lawyer, was whispering in his ear. "You ready?" Miller asked, adjusting the earpiece in Alice's ear. "Yes," she said. "Remember, the goal isn't to fight him. It's to get a location. He needs to believe he still has power." Alice nodded. She smoothed her skirt, took a deep breath, and opened the heavy metal door. The sound of the door clicking shut made Julian look up. When he saw her, a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He waved a hand at Marcus. "Give us a moment, Marcus." "Julian, I advise against—" "Out!" Julian commanded. Marcus glared at Alice, then gathered his files and left, brushing past her. Alice stood by the door, keeping her distance. "You look terrible, darling," Julian said, breaking the silence. "Jail doesn't suit your complexion. Oh, wait, you're not the one in custody, are you? Just visiting." "Where are they, Julian?" Alice asked, her voice steady. Julian laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Straight to business? I always admired that about you, even when you were drowning in a bottle of Chardonnay." "Cut the act," Alice said, stepping closer. "The FBI knows about the biometrics. They know you can't leave without Leo and Sophie. You're not holding them for leverage. You're holding them because they are your luggage." Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Smart girl, you've been paying attention. Tell me where they are, and I'll tell the DOJ to consider a plea deal regarding the murder charges." Alice lied. She had no authority to do so, but she needed him to talk. Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the metal table. His eyes went cold. "You really think you can negotiate with me? You think because you have a few agents behind that glass," he waved mockingly at the mirror, "that you have the upper hand? I'm not the one facing life in prison," Alice countered. "Life in prison," Julian scoffed. "Alice, wake up. I have files on senators. I have dirt on judges. I have the encryption keys to half the eastern seaboard's power grid. I'm not going to prison. I'm going to be relocated. I'm going to be a protected asset." He stood up and walked toward her. Alice forced herself not to flinch. "But you," Julian whispered, stopping inches from her face. "You have a problem. You see the Volkovs. They don't like loose ends. And right now, you're the biggest loose end. You signed the incorporation papers for Vance Thorne Hope. Technically on paper, you're the boss." Alice's heart skipped a beat. She remembered signing those stacks of documents years ago, trusting him blindly. "I didn't know," she said. "Doesn't matter." Julian shrugged. "The Russians will think you turned on them. If I were you, I'd be less worried about where the kids are. They're safe with Magda. And more worried about the hitman currently looking for your address." "Who is David Halloway?" Alice asked suddenly. The name hit Julian like a physical blow. He blinked, stepping back. The arrogance evaporated. "Who told you that name?" he hissed. "He's the one who turned you in, Julian." Alice pressed, sensing the weakness. "He's here, in this building. He told them everything about my parents, about the gas line." Julian's face turned a shade of grey. He began to pace the small room, running a hand through his hair. David was supposed to be in Rio. I paid him. He came back," Alice said. "He wants to make a deal. He's pinning it all on you. He says you ordered the hit specifically." "That lying little rat." Julian slammed his fist on the table, making Alice jump. "He came to me. He offered to do it. He said Thomas was going to ruin us." "We got him." Miller's voice crackled in Alice's ear. "That's a confession on the record. Good work, Alice. Now press him on the location. Alice took a step toward the pacing man. It's over, Julian. David sold you out. The only card you have left is the safety of our children. If anything happens to them, if the syndicate gets to them because you're playing games, that is on you. Do you want your son to pay for your sins? Julian stopped pacing. He looked at the wall, his breathing heavy. For the first time, the facade of the untouchable billionaire cracked, revealing the desperate criminal underneath. Magda took them to the old boathouse. Julian muttered, his voice barely audible. "What, the boathouse?" Julian shouted, spinning around, his eyes wild. "On Lake George, it's off the grid. She took them there to wait for the helicopter." "Thank you," Alice said. She turned to the door. "Alice!" Julian yelled after her. She paused, her hand on the handle. "If David is here," Julian's voice trembled with genuine terror. "If David Holloway is really in this building, you need to run." Alice frowned. "Why?" "Because David isn't just a contractor, Alice," Julian whispered. "He's the cleaner, and if he's here, he's not here to testify. He's here to finish the job." At that exact moment, the alarms in the federal building began to blare. A red strobe light flashed in the hallway. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Alice threw the door open. The hallway was chaos. Agents were running toward the elevators. Agent Miller sprinted out of the observation room, his gun drawn. "What's happening?" Alice screamed over the alarm. "Security breach on the lower levels," Miller shouted. "Someone bypassed the checkpoint using a high-level clearance badge." "David," Alice whispered. "We need to move." Miller grabbed her arm. "We need to get you to the roof. Now." As they ran toward the stairwell, a muffled explosion shook the floor beneath them. Smoke began to curl up from the elevator shaft. The media had surrounded her in shock outside, but inside the war had just begun. The hallway of the federal building had transformed into a war zone in a matter of seconds. The fire alarm continued its rhythmic, deafening shriek, whoop, 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 punctuated by the terrified shouts of administrative staff scrambling for the exits. "Keep your head down!" Agent Miller roared, shoving Alice toward the stairwell door. He kicked it open, his service weapon raised. The concrete stairwell was echoing with the sound of boots, thundering on metal steps, tactical teams moving up. But the threat wasn't coming from outside. It was already inside. "Miller." A voice echoed from the landing above. They looked up. Agent Ross was leaning over the railing, 2 floors up. "Miller, don't come up. He's on the—" A sharp, suppressed thwip sound cut through the air. Ross's head snapped back violently, and she crumpled, falling silent. Alice screamed, clapping her hands over her mouth. "Move down now." Miller grabbed Alice by the back of her coat and practically threw her down the first flight of stairs. They scrambled down the concrete steps, skipping 2 at a time. Above them, the heavy door opened. Slow, deliberate footsteps began to descend. There was no rushing, no panic in those steps. It was the rhythm of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to go. "That's Holloway," Miller grunted, wincing as he holstered his weapon to guide Alice faster. "He didn't come here to testify. He came here to wipe the board." "He killed Ross," Alice sobbed, her legs burning. "He just killed her. He's cleaning up loose ends. Julian is the primary target. You're the secondary." They reached the lobby level, but Miller didn't stop. "Lobby is a kill box. Too much glass. We're going to the garage. Sub-level 2. They burst out of the stairwell into the dim, fluorescent-lit parking garage. It was eerily quiet compared to the chaos above. Rows of black government SUVs and sedans sat in silence. "My car," Miller panted, pointing to a nondescript silver sedan in the corner. "Not the agency ones. He'll have rigged the transponders." As they ran across the oil-stained concrete, a shadow detached itself from behind a concrete pillar. It was a man in a black tactical vest wearing a gas mask. He raised a silenced pistol. Miller reacted instantly. He shoved Alice behind a parked van and returned fire. Bang, bang, bang. The deafening shots echoed in the enclosed space like cannon fire. The man in the mask jerked, hit in the shoulder, but he didn't fall. He fired back. Alice huddled by the tire of the van, squeezing her eyes shut, as glass shattered above her head. She saw Miller stumble, clutching his side. A bloom of red began to spread across his white shirt. "Miller, get in the car," Miller shouted, firing 2 more suppression shots. "Go." Alice didn't think. She scrambled on her hands and knees, yanked the passenger door of the silver sedan open, and threw herself inside. Miller limped around the back, firing blindly behind him to keep the assassin pinned, and dove into the driver's seat. He slammed the car into gear. Tires screeched burning rubber as he floored it. The assassin stepped out from cover, raising his gun calmly. Miller swerved the car directly at him. The man dove to the right, rolling across the hood of a neighboring car. They tore up the ramp, bursting through the wooden exit barrier, splintering it into pieces. The daylight of lower Manhattan hit them grey and rainy. "Are you hit?" Alice asked, frantically, looking at Miller's side. "Grazed." Miller lied through gritted teeth. His face was pale sweat beading on his forehead. "Ribs might be broken, but I can drive." He navigated through the gridlocked traffic, mounting the curb to bypass a bus sirens wailing in the distance behind them. "Where are we going?" Alice asked her hands, shaking as she gripped the dashboard. "We need to call the police." "The army, anyone?" Miller shook his head, his eyes checking the rearview mirror constantly. "Holloway isn't working alone. He got into a federal building with a weapon. That means he has high-level clearance codes. If we call it in, they'll track our location. We can't trust the frequency." Alice looked at him, realizing the terrified implication. "So we're on our own. Until we have those kids," Miller said grimly, merging onto the FDR drive north. "We are the only ones who know where they are. If Holloway kills Julian back there, and I'm betting he already has, then the only loose ends left are you. And the children." Alice felt a cold dread wash over her that had nothing to do with the rain outside. If Julian told me where they are, then he probably told Holloway too under duress. Miller finished, or Holloway already knew. Alice looked at the digital clock on the dashboard. 3:45 p.m. "How far is Lake George?" she asked. "In this weather, 4 hours," Miller said. He pressed down harder on the accelerator. "We're going to do it in 3. The drive north was a blur of grey highway and windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the intensifying storm. As they left the city limits and entered the Hudson Valley, the rain turned into a torrential downpour, slashing sideways against the car. Miller was fading. Alice could see it. The greys on his side had soaked through his jacket. His breathing was shallow. "Let me drive," Alice said for the 3rd time. "I'm fine." Miller grunted, his eyes fixed on the road. "You don't know evasive driving." "I know how to drive a car, Agent Miller, and you're going to pass out and kill us both." Miller hesitated, then swore softly as a wave of dizziness hit him. He pulled the car onto the shoulder of the empty highway, the tires crunching on wet gravel. They switched places in the pouring rain. Alice soaked instantly, her expensive court dress clinging to her skin. She jumped into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel. Miller slumped into the passenger side, applying pressure to his wound with a wad of napkins from the glove box. "Keep it steady," Miller whispered, his eyes closing. "Watch for tails. Black SUVs. Sedans with no plates." Alice merged back onto the highway. The speedometer climbed, 80 mph, 90 mph. She had never driven this fast in her life. She was a Greenwich housewife, used to driving a Volvo to yoga class. Now she was driving a getaway car to save her children from a cartel hitman. "You are not weak," she told herself, gripping the wheel until her knuckles turned white. "Julian made you think you were weak, but you survived him. You can survive this." 2 hours passed. The scenery changed from strip malls to dark looming pine trees. They were entering the Adirondacks. The signal on the radio cut in and out. "Breaking news." The radio crackled. "Explosion at 26 Federal Plaza. Sources say Julian Thorne found dead in his holding cell. Suspect at large." Alice gasped. Julian was dead, the father of her children, the monster who ruined her life. He was gone. "He got him," Miller murmured, not opening his eyes. "Holloway cleaned the house." "That means he's coming for us," Alice said, her voice trembling. "He knows Julian is dead. He knows the job isn't finished. Just drive, Alice." They reached the exit for Lake George around 6:30 p.m. It was pitch black. The winding roads around the lake were treacherous, slick with wet leaves and mud. "Where is the boathouse?" Alice asked. Miller checked a GPS device he had pulled from his pocket. "Turn right at the next fork. It's a private access road. Thorne bought the property through a shell company last year." Alice swung the car right. The paved road ended, turning into a dirt track that wound deep into the forest. The trees formed a tunnel overhead, blocking out what little moonlight existed. Suddenly Miller sat up, groaning in pain. "Kill the lights." "What?" "Kill the headlights now." Alice instinctively flipped the switch. The world plunged into absolute darkness. She slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt in the mud. "Why?" she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Look." Miller pointed through the windshield. About half a mile down the hill through the trees there was a faint glow. It was the boathouse. But it wasn't the warm glow of a fireplace. It was the sweeping beams of flashlights, several of them. "Someone beat us here," Miller said, drawing his weapon. He checked the magazine. 2 rounds left. Damn it! "Is it Holloway?" Alice asked, terrified. "Maybe. Or Magda's backup. We can't drive down there. They'll hear the engine. We walk. We walk." They got out of the car. The rain had slowed to a freezing drizzle. Alice shivered, her teeth chattering, but she didn't complain. She followed Miller into the woods, moving silently over the wet pine needles. They crept closer to the boathouse. It was a large, modern structure, built right over the water, isolated from the nearest neighbors by miles of forest. They reached the edge of the clearing and crouched behind a pile of logs. Alice peered out. There was a black SUV parked in front of the boathouse. The driver's door was open. Inside the house, she could see silhouettes moving against the blinds. Then, a sound that stopped her heart. A child's scream. "No, let me go!" "Leo!" Alice gasped. She started to stand up. Miller yanked her back down. "Wait, assess!" The front door of the boathouse flew open. A woman stumbled out, Magda. She was dragging a suitcase with one hand and holding Sophie's hand with the other. Leo was kicking and screaming, being pulled along by a large man in a leather jacket. It wasn't Holloway. It was a hired goon, Russian by the sound of the shouting. "Move, move!" the man yelled. "Boss says burn it down." "Burn it down," Alice whispered. "They're scrubbing the site," Miller said. "They're taking the kids and destroying the evidence." The man in the leather jacket stopped. He looked toward the woods, right where Alice and Miller were hiding. He tapped his earpiece. "Hold," the man said. "I heard something." He pulled a gun from his waistband and began walking slowly toward the tree line. Miller looked at Alice. His face was grey, drained of blood. He pressed his gun into her hand. It was heavy cold and terrifying. "I can't," Alice said, her eyes wide. "You have to." Miller whispered. "I'm going to draw his fire. I'm going to step out. When he turns to shoot me, you run for the kids. Do not stop. Do not look back. Miller, you'll die," she said, tears mixing with the rain on her face. Miller offered a weak, bloody smile. "It's the job, Alice. Get your kids back." He took a deep breath. He didn't have a gun anymore. He picked up a heavy rock from the ground. "Go!" Miller screamed. He surged up from behind the logs, throwing the rock and charging at the Russian with a primal yell. The Russian spun around, startled. He raised his gun and fired. Bang! Miller jerked, but his momentum carried him forward, tackling the man. They went down in the mud, struggling for the weapon. Alice didn't freeze. The mother in her took over primal and fierce. She sprinted across the clearing. "Leo, Sophie!" she screamed. Magda looked up, her eyes widening in horror. "Mrs. Vance!" "Let them go, Magda!" Alice yelled, raising the gun with both hands. She had no idea if the safety was on. She just pointed it at the nanny. Magda hesitated. She looked at the gun, then at the kids. "He'll kill us all," Magda sobbed. "Holloway, he's coming." "He's not here yet," Alice shouted. "Give me my children." Leo broke free from the nanny's grip and ran to Alice. "Mum!" Sophie followed. Alice grabbed them both, wrapping one arm around them, while keeping the gun trained on Magda. Behind her, another gunshot rang out. Then silence. Alice spun around, her heart in her throat. Miller was lying face down in the mud. The Russian man stood up, wiping blood from his lip. He picked up his gun. He looked at Alice, then at the kids. A cruel smirk spread across his face. "Family reunion," he sneered, raising his weapon. "How sweet." Alice shielded her children with her body. She squeezed the trigger of Miller's gun. Click. It was empty. The Russian laughed. "Goodbye, Mrs. Vance." He tightened his finger on the trigger. Crack. A single shot rang out from the darkness of the lake. The Russian's head snapped forward. He dropped to his knees, then fell face first into the dirt, dead, before he hit the ground. Alice gasped, looking toward the water. A small motorboat was drifting toward the dock, the engine idling low. A figure stood at the bow, lowering a long-range rifle. The figure stepped onto the dock and walked into the light of the porch. It was a man in a pristine charcoal suit, unbothered by the rain. He adjusted his glasses. "David Holloway," Alice whispered. He wasn't there to save them. He had just eliminated the competition. Alice froze, clutching Leo and Sophie so tightly she could feel their frantic heartbeats against her chest. The rain had stopped leaving behind, a silence so profound it felt heavy. David Holloway walked up the muddy bank from the dock. Up close, he didn't look like a monster. He looked like an accountant who just happened to be carrying a sniper rifle. He stepped over the body of the Russian hitman without even glancing down. "Sloppy," Holloway muttered, adjusting his cuff. Julian always did hire the cheapest labor. He stopped 10 feet from Alice. He rested the rifle against his shoulder, the barrel pointing at the sky. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Please," Alice whispered, her voice cracking. "Take the money. Take whatever Julian had stashed here. Just let them go." Holloway tilted his head. "You think I'm here for the money?" "You killed Julian," Alice said, emboldened by the adrenaline. "I heard it on the radio. You killed Agent Ross. You're cleaning house." "I killed Julian because he broke the rules," Holloway said calmly. "He brought civilians into the game. He brought children into the game." He looked at Leo and Sophie, his eyes softening for a brief second. "And I killed Agent Ross because she was about to put a bullet in the back of Agent Miller's head." Alice blinked, stunned. "What?" "Ross was the mole, Mrs. Vance," Holloway said. "She was on Julian's payroll for 3 years. Why do you think she tried to stop Miller from bringing you to the safe house? Why do you think she tried to keep you at the federal building? She was setting you up for the kill." Alice looked back at Miller's unmoving body in the mud. "Is he—" "He's alive," Holloway said. "Tough guy. He'll have a headache when he wakes up, but he'll live." He reached into his jacket pocket. Alice flinched, shielding the kids again. But Holloway didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a small silver USB drive. He tossed it through the air. Alice caught it with one hand. It was cold and heavy. "What is this?" "The leverage," Holloway said. "That's the master key to the offshore accounts, the ones Julian put in the kids' names. It's clean now. The syndicate thinks the money burned with the house. It's yours." Alice stared at the drive, then back at the assassin. Why are you helping us?" Holloway picked up his rifle. He turned toward the dark water where his boat waited. "I have a daughter, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice low. "She's about Sophie's age, and when I saw you on those courthouse steps, when I saw you stand between Julian and the FBI, I decided that today the bad guys weren't going to win." In the distance, the wail of sirens began to pierce the night air. State troopers, the cavalry. "They'll be here in 5 minutes, Holloway said. He stepped onto the boat and untied the rope. "Tell Miller he owes me a beer." He revved the engine. The boat slipped into the darkness of Lake George, disappearing into the mist, as if he had never been there. "Mom," Leo whispered, looking up at her. "Is it over?" Alice looked at the USB drive in her hand, the future of her children, the restitution for her parents, the power to rebuild everything Julian had destroyed. She looked at Miller, who was groaning and starting to stir in the mud. She looked at the flashing blue lights winding down the hill. She took a deep breath of the cold, clean air. She wasn't the scared woman who had walked out of the courthouse hours ago. She wasn't a victim anymore. She kissed Leo's forehead. "Yes, baby. It's finally over." 6 months later. The gavel hit the mahogany block, but this time the sound was sweet. "Case dismissed," the judge said. "All charges against Alice Vance are dropped. Full custody of the minors remains with the mother." Alice stood up. She was wearing a white suit this time. She looked radiant. She shook hands with her new lawyer, the best in the city. She walked out of the courtroom holding Leo and Sophie's hands. When she pushed open the heavy doors to the street, the cameras were there again. The flashes went off, blinding and bright. But Alice didn't look down. She didn't hide. She stopped at the top of the stairs. She looked directly into the lens of the nearest camera. She smiled a smile of pure, unbreakable steel. "Mrs. Vance, Mrs. Vance, what will you do now that you've inherited the Thorne estate?" a reporter shouted. Alice adjusted her sunglasses. "I'm going to build some libraries," she said. And with that, she walked down the steps, not alone, but surrounded by the only thing that mattered. She walked away from the past and into a future she owned completely. And that is the incredible story of Alice Vance, from a woman stripped of everything in a courtroom to a mother who took down an empire to save her children. It just goes to show that sometimes the person you think is the weakest in the room is actually the most dangerous. What do you think was Holloway, a hero or a villain? And would you have kept the money like Alice did? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this roller coaster of a story, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow, and subscribe with notifications on, so you never miss a new story. We drop new dramas every week. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.